My name is Lillian Crowley, and the day my daughter-in-law became my boss was also the day she fired me. You might think this is one of those stories where everything unravels in a dramatic explosion of yelling and accusations. But no, it wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet, controlled, and cold. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because what happened in that boardroom will stay with you long after the story ends. I never thought I'd still be working at 68. Not because I was rich, not at all. It's just that my husband Richard always said, when the time comes, we'll enjoy retirement together. But Richard passed away 5 years ago. Cancer fast and merciless. We had some savings, yes, but most of it went into his care. And the silence after he was gone. It was unbearable. So I stayed at the job I'd held for 32 years. I wasn't some top executive or department head. I was just consistent, dependable, the kind of employee that didn't make noise but made things work. I handled invoices, balanced the books, trained new hires on how not to mess up payroll. I never asked for promotions, never caused issues. I was the wallpaper of the company, always there quietly holding the place together. When my son David married Melanie, I was genuinely happy. Melanie was sharp, charismatic, and ambitious in a way that reminded me of how I used to be before life softened my edges. She had a background in finance, and David, my sweet but scattered boy, worked in creative. They were a strange match, but they made sense like fire and oxygen. Dangerous if misused, but full of life. When Melanie got hired at the company, I didn't raise a brow. She'd earned her spot, and I kept our personal lives completely separate from the workplace. I didn't even mention to anyone that we were related. I wanted her to rise or fall on her own merit. And rise she did. In just 3 years, Melanie went from junior financial analyst to chief strategy officer. The old CEO, a quiet man named Thomas Avery, took notice of her during a crisis and started mentoring her personally. I saw the writing on the wall when he began slowly stepping back, talking about retirement, easing off the reins. Still, when the internal email arrived announcing that Melanie had been appointed interim CEO pending shareholder confirmation, I froze. There was no department-wide meeting, no acknowledgement of her relationship to me, no greeting in the hallway. Just an email. I remember standing in the break room, still holding my mug of black coffee, reading the message over and over while my fingertips turned numb against the ceramic. Melanie was now my boss. She didn't speak to me that day. Not a nod, not a smile, not even a glance. She passed my desk twice and looked straight ahead. I told myself maybe she was overwhelmed. The new title, the new power. Maybe she didn't want to be accused of favoritism. But in my gut, I felt it. Something colder. Something more permanent than professional distance. It was 4:47 p.m. when my desk phone rang. An unfamiliar number flashed. I picked it up. Lillian. Hi. Could you come to the executive office for a quick chat? Melanie's voice. Polite. Neutral. I said nothing at first. Then yes, of course. The walk to that office felt longer than usual, like the floor stretched itself out beneath my feet. My heart thudded once hard, then dropped into an eerie calm. I knocked on the glass door. Come in. Melanie sat behind a desk I had dusted off for decades. Her nails were freshly painted the color of wine. A folder lay before her. Her expression was unreadable. Thank you for coming, she began. I'll be brief. She pushed the folder forward. This is your exit package. We're letting you go. Effective immediately. I didn't move. We're restructuring, she added, voice rehearsed. And your position is being eliminated. I looked at the folder, then back at her. My daughter-in-law. The woman who once cried in my kitchen after a fight with David, who once hugged me like a real mother. Now sitting there like I was just a line item to be crossed off. Okay, I said quietly. Just one word. Her eyebrows twitched. She hadn't expected that. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. I stood, picked up the folder, and left the room. It was drizzling outside when I walked to my car. The kind of rain that didn't soak you but left a chill that crawled under your clothes. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, the folder on my lap unopened. No one from the office said goodbye. No one asked what happened. I drove home in silence. My house felt cavernous without Richard, especially in moments like these. I heated up some leftover soup, ate slowly, then walked into our old bedroom. I opened Richard's wardrobe. Everything was still there. His suits, his favorite tie with the coffee stain, his watch that I couldn't bear to wind. Then I remembered something. Years ago, maybe 10, maybe more, he handed me a small envelope sealed with wax and said, "Only open this when the job becomes unbearable." Back then I'd laughed. "You think I'd stay that long?" He just smiled. "I think you'll stay longer than you should. That's who you are." The envelope was still in the drawer beneath a stack of old insurance files. I broke the seal. Inside was one sentence on our law firm's letterhead. 25% voting share, Lillian Crowley. Transfer complete. In case of conflict, call John Dempsey. My hands trembled. I wasn't just someone who worked at the company. I was someone who owned it. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, holding that single sheet of paper against my chest, like it could warm the parts of me Melanie had left cold. 25%. A quarter of the company. Richard had never told me. Not really. He'd hinted, of course, mumbled once, that he'd set some things in motion in case the company ever tried to phase out the old guard. But I thought he meant a savings account. Not this. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I brushed my silver hair smooth applied foundation with a steady hand and wore the dark blue blouse Richard always said made me look like I run the whole damn building. A ridiculous thought back then. Not anymore. I called the law office right after breakfast. "Dempsey and Klein, good morning." "Hello. I need to speak to Mr. John Dempsey. It's Lillian Crowley." The pause was brief but meaningful. "One moment, please." John came on quickly, his voice warm but businesslike. "Lillian, I was wondering when you'd call. You knew about this." I helped Richard draw up the documents. He insisted everything remain sealed unless the company forgot who helped build it. My throat tightened. They forgot. I'm not surprised. He explained everything. Richard had purchased the shares discreetly over several years, buying out former partners who were retiring, absorbing fractional stakes from silent investors. Slowly but surely, he built a quarter stake. Then he placed them under my name. Quietly. Completely legal. "You're on the board, Lillian? And with 25%, you can make noise if you want to." I didn't want to make noise. I wanted to be heard. John walked me through the next steps. Filing notice to attend the annual shareholder meeting. Reviewing bylaws. Preparing a motion if I wanted to challenge leadership. "The meeting is in 10 days, he said. "You'll have your moment." I hung up and sat in silence for a long time. I wasn't a vengeful person. That's not who I was raised to be. I was raised to keep the family together, to forgive, to smooth things over. But something had shifted. Melanie hadn't just removed me from a job, she'd discarded me from my own life. And David, my son, hadn't called. Not once. Not even to ask if I was okay. I thought of all the nights I'd babysat so they could go on dates, all the weekends I brought meals over so Melanie could rest, all the birthdays I helped plan, all the times I defended her when others called her cold, ruthless, ambitious to a fault. "She just needs someone to believe in her," I used to say, and maybe she still did. But that someone would no longer be me. I spent the following days preparing, not dramatically, not with fury, just calmly, methodically. I reread every employee manual I had helped write. I reviewed the leadership structure. I read the company's financials, the same reports I used to process with Melanie before she became too important to read them herself. I even polished my old leather briefcase. It smelled like dust and lavender. Each night I wrote down what I wanted to say in the meeting. I wrote it, tore it up, rewrote it. Not a speech, just a motion, a suggestion to the board. That the current CEO lacked the temperament for leadership. That her decision to terminate a long-serving employee without board approval violated internal ethics. That her appointment should be reviewed, and her position reconsidered. The words looked strange in my handwriting, like they belonged to someone more powerful. Then I reminded myself, The morning of the meeting, I arrived 15 minutes early. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. I smiled. "I'm here for the shareholder meeting." She stammered a greeting, then ushered me to the conference room. It looked the same. long mahogany table, executive chairs with too much padding, water pitchers and notepads lined up like soldiers. I took a seat at the far end where the light from the window hit my face directly. I wanted them to see me clearly. The room filled slowly. Melanie entered last, flanked by two junior executives. She glanced at me, but only briefly. Her face didn't change. No smile. No confusion. Just calculation. "Let's begin," she said crisply. They went through the usual agenda: quarterly reports, growth targets, proposed acquisitions. I sat silent. Then came the open floor for motions. I stood. "I'd like to raise a motion," I said. Every head turned. Melanie blinked. "I propose that the board review the qualifications and ethical decision-making of the acting CEO," I said, my voice steady. "Specifically, her recent decision to terminate a long-term employee, myself, without board consultation and without acknowledging a clear conflict of interest." The silence was deafening. Then, "And who exactly are you to raise this motion?" Melanie asked, her voice tight, icy. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a notarized document. "I own 25% of this company," I said. "My husband transferred the shares before his passing. That gives me voting rights." And a voice. Gasps broke the silence. Even the chairman, an old colleague of Richard, looked stunned. He took the paper, scanned it, and nodded slowly. "It's legitimate," he said. Melanie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. David wasn't there. He never showed. I didn't need him to. I wasn't there to get even. I was there to restore dignity. Mine and the company's. The vote was scheduled for the next meeting per procedure. But the message was clear. Lillian Crowley was not invisible. Not anymore. The news traveled faster than I expected. By the next morning, I was receiving emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some congratulated me in whispers, others sent cautiously worded support, just enough to express alignment, but not enough to put their jobs at risk. That's how corporate worked. No applause until it was safe to clap. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the way the receptionist now stood up straighter when I entered the building. In the way junior analysts who once barely acknowledged me now nodded with a hint of respect. They didn't know what to call me. I wasn't technically an executive. I wasn't an employee either. I was just a quiet storm that had rolled in from nowhere, a voting shareholder. Melanie, on the other hand, remained composed. Or at least she performed composure convincingly. 3 days after the meeting, I received a call from her assistant. Melanie had scheduled a private conversation with me in her office. It was not a request. I arrived 5 minutes early. Melanie's office had changed since the last time I was there. She'd redecorated with sleek black shelves, a glass desk, and a large abstract painting that looked like an ink spill bleeding down canvas. It felt cold. Sterile. She was sitting behind the desk wearing a tailored ivory blazer that almost made her seem soft. Almost. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. I didn't sit. She waited a beat, then folded her hands. "I'd like to clear the air." I raised an eyebrow. She continued. "I realize my handling of your departure wasn't ideal, but from a strategic standpoint it was necessary. There's been pressure to modernize the staff structure." "You represented the old guard?" I stayed silent. "I never wanted this to get personal." She added, her tone tighter now. "And I don't want a boardroom battle that divides the company or the family." There it was. The veiled threat wrapped in the illusion of diplomacy. "I didn't come here for war, Melanie," I said. "But you declared it the moment you handed me that folder without blinking." She exhaled, irritated. "I didn't want to fire you." "But you did." Silence. "You could have called. You could have pulled me aside. You could have said, 'Mom, this is awkward, but we need to talk.' Instead, you sent me out like an expired asset." "Because that's what you were?" she snapped. The room seemed to contract. I didn't flinch. "That's the problem," I said calmly. "You think this company runs on spreadsheets and power plays. But it runs on people. People who remember who helped them learn their first Excel formula. Who stayed late to fix an error that wasn't theirs. People like me." She laughed once, sharp, joyless. "You think nostalgia is a strategy?" "No," I replied. "But respect is." For the first time I saw it. Not just ambition, but fear. Melanie wasn't afraid of me personally. She was afraid of what I represented. the proof that her rise wasn't as stable as she imagined. That someone who spent years quietly building relationships could hold more power than someone who bulldozed their way to the top. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. "What's this?" "A formal copy of my motion for review. And my proxy statement." "You're going forward with it?" she asked, incredulous. "I already did." She sat back, silent. "I won't drag you," I said. "I won't smear your name. I won't even bring up the fact that you're my daughter-in-law. But I will let the board see who you are through your actions." "You think they'll vote me out?" "I think they'll do what's best for the company." That was the truth. Because as much as I wanted justice, I didn't want destruction. I didn't want Melanie humiliated. But I did want her replaced. For the sake of every employee who feared walking into her office. For every veteran worker who now walked on eggshells. For every woman who aged out of relevance and was tossed aside by someone who should have known better. That night, I sat at home rereading old notes Richard had left in his journals. He'd written once in his slanted handwriting, "Leadership isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the most remembered when you leave it." I was starting to understand what he meant. The next few days moved slowly. Rumors swirled. My name began appearing on internal email chains. The chairman reached out for a private call. I shared my concerns not bitterly but truthfully. He listened. Took notes, asked questions. He remembered working with Richard, said he regretted not seeing the internal shift happening faster. Then came the second board meeting. I wore the same blouse as before, the dark blue one. I arrived 5 minutes early, sat at the same end of the table. This time, Melanie didn't speak first. The chairman did. "Before we begin," he said, "we have a shareholder motion on the floor. The motion proposes a leadership review of the acting CEO on the grounds of ethical conflict, poor morale, and questionable conduct during a recent staff termination." Melanie sat very still. Then, "This is ridiculous. Let the board vote," the chairman said. The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning and hands reaching for voting slips. One by one, each member cast their vote. I didn't look at Melanie. I didn't need to. I already knew. She was losing, and for once she had no one to blame but herself. When the final vote was counted, the chairman cleared his throat, a subtle gesture that somehow echoed like thunder through the boardroom. "Motion passes," he said, voice low but unmistakably final. "Effective immediately, the acting CEO will be placed on administrative leave, pending full leadership review. Interim duties will be reassigned." No applause. No audible reactions. Just stunned silence. The kind of silence that comes when power so carefully hoarded evaporates in plain view. I didn't look at Melanie right away. I didn't need to see her crumble. That wasn't the point. But I heard her chair creak. "Is this a joke?" she whispered, though no one answered. The very people who had once praised her sharp strategies and fearless reforms were now avoiding eye contact, glancing down at their papers or fiddling with their pens. Corporate loyalty was a fragile thing. One wrong move and the tide turned fast. "I built the last 2 quarters of growth," she hissed. "You think this betrayal will go unnoticed by the market?" "This isn't about the market," the chairman said simply. "It's about the culture." Melanie stood abruptly, the chair tipping slightly behind her. She didn't yell. That would have made her weak. Instead, she straightened her blazer and said, "Fine, I'll take my leave. But this company just stepped back into the 1980s and you'll regret it." She walked out, high heels striking the floor like the ticking of a bomb. And just like that, she was gone. I remained seated. There was no satisfaction in watching her leave. Not in the conventional sense. No gloating, no triumphant grin, only a strange hollow quiet. Because for all her ruthlessness, Melanie wasn't just my daughter-in-law. She was once someone I loved. Once I watched her dance with my son under paper lanterns at their wedding, her laughter blooming like confetti in the backyard air. Once she handed me a baby blanket and asked if I would help raise their daughter while they figured out life. I had said yes every time. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that she'd fired me, but that she'd forgotten I had always been on her side. After the meeting adjourned, the board members approached me one by one. Some offered handshakes, others warm half-smiles. Their eyes filled with quiet apology for what had transpired. The chairman lingered last. We'll need a few weeks to formalize the transition. In the meantime, we'd appreciate your input. I'm not here to take over, I said softly. I didn't say you were, but this company owes you more than silence. He paused, then added, Richard would have been proud. I nodded, my throat tight. Later that evening, I returned home and collapsed into Richard's old chair. The one with the worn armrest from years of gripping it too tightly during Sunday football games. I stared at the fireless hearth. I didn't feel like a victor. Just restored. A few hours passed before my phone buzzed. It was a message from David. I heard what happened. Melanie told me her side. I'm sure you think you did the right thing, but all you did was break your own family. I read it twice. 3 times. There was no, are you okay? No. Why didn't you tell me? Only blame. Deflection. Like mother, like wife. I didn't respond. I turned the phone face down and let the silence settle. The next morning, I arrived at the office not as a returning employee, not quite as an executive, but something in between. A survivor of corporate amnesia. They gave me a temporary desk on the executive floor. Someone had already left a small arrangement of lilies with a note. Welcome back. It's better with you here. I didn't ask who sent it. I just breathed in the scent. It was the first time the building had felt warm in years. That afternoon, I walked past my old cubicle. It was still empty. The new team hadn't decided what to do with it yet. I stepped inside for a moment and ran my fingers along the edge of the desk. A photo of Richard and me at the company picnic, faded but intact, was still taped to the partition wall. I smiled. Not because of revenge. Not because Melanie was gone. But because finally I was seen. Later that week, a new interim CEO was appointed. She was a soft-spoken woman from operations with a reputation for integrity and collaboration. The announcement didn't mention Melanie's removal. Corporate messaging favored vague language. Leadership transition, strategic change, new direction. But inside the walls, people knew, and more importantly, they remembered. They remembered that I had walked back in, not with fury, but with quiet strength. With proof that dignity can be more powerful than dominance. That silence, when wielded right, can be louder than any boardroom scream. A few days later, I received one final letter. From Melanie. Handwritten. Lillian, you won. I hope it was worth it. I hope the boardroom cheers feel louder than the silence at your family dinners. Because I won't be at them anymore. Melanie. I folded the letter without emotion. Because no, I hadn't won. This wasn't about winning. It was about remembering who I was. And reminding her who I had been all along. A mother. A worker. A woman who never stopped believing in grace until it was taken from her. And then she rewrote the rules. The days that followed moved slower, quieter. The building didn't change overnight, of course. There were still lingering whispers in corners, some in support, others wrapped in cynicism. A few said I'd orchestrated it for revenge, that I was just a bitter old woman who didn't want to let go. I didn't argue. I didn't explain, because people always talk louder when they don't know what it took for you to stay silent. What they didn't see were the nights I sat at the dinner table alone, placing a second plate out of habit and then putting it back. They didn't see me standing outside the baby's room when Melanie and David still lived with us during their rough patch. How I would sing softly through the door when the baby cried and Melanie was too tired to move. They didn't see the years I gave uncredited, unpaid, and undeserved. But I saw them. I remembered every small sacrifice, every withheld opinion, every swallowed frustration, every "it's okay" when it wasn't. That's the tax women like me pay to keep families together. But this time I let it break. And strangely, the world didn't end. David didn't call again. There were no apologies, no clarifying messages. Just that one bitter text now buried under my missed call log like a bruise under makeup. But what surprised me most, what truly struck me, was what came instead. The emails. From younger employees. From women I'd mentored decades ago. From admin staff who'd felt invisible since Melanie's rise. Thank you for reminding them we matter. I was going to quit last month. You changed my mind. They told me I was too much for caring. You proved too much is exactly what we need. Each one was a whisper in a growing chorus of voices long ignored. I began to realize that what I did wasn't just personal, it was generational. And it wasn't just about Melanie. It was about every woman who'd ever trained a younger man who later became her boss. Every grandmother who raised a child's child while being treated like she was in the way. Every loyal worker who was dismissed as dead weight by someone too young to know what legacy even means. I didn't return to full-time work. That wasn't the point. But the board did ask me to consult quietly, informally on company culture. They said they needed someone who understands the soul of the company. I accepted, not because I needed the money, but because I knew what was at stake. A few weeks into this new role, I crossed paths with Melanie's replacement, Cynthia Torres. She was 45, sharp and attentive. But what struck me most was that she listened, truly listened. She asked about the origins of certain systems, the people behind the processes. She didn't just see numbers, she saw names. "You've kept this place alive longer than most of us realize," she said to me one afternoon. I shrugged. "I just stayed long enough to be useful." "No," she said. "You stayed long enough to make history." I laughed. A soft, tired sound, but it felt good. One evening, I took the long way home. I drove past Melanie and David's house. The porch light was on, but the windows were dark. I wondered if they were eating in silence, or arguing, or pretending I no longer existed. And I let myself feel it. The loss. Because that's what it was. A real aching grief, not for the job, but for the family I thought I had. Grief doesn't always come with caskets and casseroles. Sometimes it comes with envelopes and signatures. Sometimes it comes when your daughter-in-law calls you redundant instead of mom. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the rain streak across the glass, like the world was trying to remember how to cry. I didn't expect reconciliation. I didn't expect understanding. But I did expect myself to survive, and I was, slowly, surely. A few days later, I got an invitation, not from David or Melanie, but from HR. They were holding a company recognition dinner, highlighting contributions from long-term staff both past and present. There would be speeches, and they asked if I would attend. I almost declined, but something in me whispered, "Go." So I did. That night, in a modest banquet room with string lights hanging like memory threads from the ceiling, I stood behind a lectern while familiar faces looked up at me. And I told them the truth. Not about Melanie. Not about the boardroom. But about staying, about showing up, about finding value in being invisible, and then learning to demand to be seen. I didn't think I'd become the story I said into the microphone. I only ever wanted to be part of the chapter that built something lasting. People stood, some applauded, some cried. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Closure, not revenge, not justice, not even peace. Just the simple, unshakable truth that I was still here, still standing, still Lillian. And that was enough. After the dinner, I sat in my car for a while, letting the echoes of applause settle into silence. The night was still and cool, and for once, I didn't feel like I was in anyone's way. I didn't feel like a burden. I didn't feel erased. I felt real. A woman in her late 60s, no longer married, no longer defined by anyone's title or position, but still holding space in a company, in a story, in her own life. That's when I made the decision. I wasn't going back to the job full-time. I wasn't going to spend my days relearning new software or sitting through rebranding meetings with 20-somethings talking in acronyms. But I also wasn't done yet. There were still too many women in that building, hell in the world, who were walking quietly through hallways they helped build, slowly being pushed to the edges of relevance, forgotten, until they disappeared. So I created something new. It started small, a lunchtime mentorship circle. Just 5 women at first, young staffers who felt unseen, and older ones who felt like their best years had been packed into forgotten file drawers. We met once a week in the break room. No PowerPoints, no corporate jargon, just stories, real ones. Stories about office politics, about career pivots, about navigating motherhood and ambition, about how to make yourself visible when people stop looking at you. Word spread. 5 became 10, 10 became 20. Eventually, we were given an actual room, an old training center with whiteboards and a broken projector. It didn't matter. What mattered was that people were showing up. I called it the archive. Because every woman there had history, knowledge, strength. They just needed somewhere to put it before someone else erased it. One afternoon, as I was setting out coffee for the group, Cynthia, the new CEO, stepped in. She took a seat in the back, without fanfare. Afterward, she came up to me. "You're building something," she said. "I'm just dusting off what was already there." She smiled. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. People feel different." Different how? Heard, she said. And when people feel heard, they stop whispering and start leading. It was a strange compliment, but it stayed with me. Months passed. Seasons changed. And slowly, the company I had once considered leaving quietly became a place I was proud to be a part of again. Not because I had power, but because I'd reclaimed presence. Meanwhile, Melanie disappeared. Not from the public eye, not completely. Her LinkedIn still listed strategic consultant, and occasionally her name surfaced in trade newsletters. But in our world, our small company world, she was a ghost. People didn't mention her, not out of spite, but because she had removed herself. She had chosen ambition over alliance, control over connection. And the cost of that? Oblivion. One Saturday, I went to the farmer's market and, to my surprise, saw David across the aisle. He was alone, browsing tomatoes. We hadn't spoken since his last text. He looked up, saw me, and for a moment, just one breath's length, we both froze. Then he walked over. "Hi, Mom." I nodded. "David." He shifted awkwardly. "You look good. So do you—" Silence. Again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, "She still won't talk about it. She doesn't have to." He nodded slowly. "I was angry at first. Thought you were out for blood. But now, I think you were just finally done being invisible." I tilted my head. "And what are you going to do with that realization?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm sorry." He didn't say it like a son begging forgiveness. He said it like a man confronting a version of his mother he never really knew. The one who wasn't just there to soothe or serve. The one who remembered everything. "I hope you find peace, David," I said. "You too, Mom." We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just stood there for a moment in the middle of fresh produce and strangers. And then he turned and walked away. I stood still for a while, letting the sun warm the crown of my head, the heat sinking into the silver of my hair. I felt older. Not tired, just deeply, authentically older. Like time had carved its name into me, and instead of erasing it, I'd finally learned to wear it. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. No board motions. No ledgers. Just a letter to myself. You were never just the background. You were the bones. And when they tried to tear you out quietly, you came back louder than thunder without ever raising your voice. You stayed kind. You stayed calm. And somehow you still stayed you. That was your power all along. I signed it. Lillian. Because after everything, after betrayal, silence and truth, I finally remembered. I'm not just someone's mother. Not just someone's wife. Not just someone's employee. I'm someone. Weeks later, I was standing in the elevator watching the floors light up one by one. I was headed to the fourth Human Resources, now home to my mentorship group's materials and schedule board, but the elevator didn't stop there. Instead, it opened on the executive floor. A young man in a tight blue suit stepped in. His ID badge read D. Carter, Strategy Team. He looked over, recognized me, and straightened up. "Mrs. Crowley," he said nervously. "You were in the shareholder meeting, right? The one where things changed." I offered a soft smile. "Yes, that was me." He hesitated, then said, "I just want to say thanks." It was the first time I saw someone do the right thing when it wasn't easy. The elevator dinged. My floor. I looked at him and said, "It's never easy, but it's worth it." I stepped off, leaving him standing there, maybe questioning his own choices, or maybe just realizing that quiet people sometimes carry thunder. The mentorship program had evolved. What started as the archive had now expanded into 3 tracks: career mentorship, conflict navigation, and legacy planning. A younger woman named Paige helped run it now, an intern I once guided through her first budget reconciliation when she was shaking with self-doubt. She now held her clipboard like a sword. "Lillian," she called out. "We just had 3 more people sign up, 1 from product design, 2 from facilities. All ages." I nodded, pleased. Let's find space for everyone. We had more chairs than we needed, more ears than we expected, and somehow more stories than any of us realized we'd been holding in. But still, I found myself drifting towards solitude sometimes. At home, the evenings were long. I would sit by the window, a crocheted blanket draped over my legs, reading old notebooks filled with Richard's notes. There were scribbles on business strategy, half-finished to-do lists, and one page torn from the middle of a pad that read only, "Trust her. She won't speak first, but when she does, it'll be the last word anyone remembers." It was dated 3 years before he died. I pressed the page to my chest and closed my eyes. He had known. He always did. He used to say I was like the foundation of a building. Not flashy, not visible, but if removed, everything else crumbled. And he was right. I'd held up more than anyone saw. That Friday, I received an official invitation to attend the annual Founders Dinner, a formal, tightly curated event for the company's top contributors and strategic minds. It was mostly attended by executives, board members, and a few select visionaries. I'd never been invited before. The envelope was embossed, the font elegant. Inside. To Lillian Crowley, in recognition of your enduring contributions and the cultural integrity you have restored to our institution. You are not a guest of honor. You are the honor. I sat very still for a long time, not because I needed the recognition, but because someone finally saw the whole story, not just the chapters written in spreadsheets, but the ones written in silence, in tears, in withheld wrath, the ones written in grace. At the dinner, I wore a midnight blue shawl over a silver blouse, my hair pinned into a soft chignon. I didn't say much, but when I walked in, heads turned. Not with pity, not with surprise, with respect. People made room for me at the table, and that was enough. As I sipped champagne, I glanced across the ballroom. In a distant corner, I saw Melanie. She wasn't part of the event, she was just there. Not officially on the guest list, likely attending as someone's +1. She saw me too, and for the briefest second her eyes softened. Not with regret, not with forgiveness, but with a small flicker of acknowledgement that she understood, maybe for the first time, who she had tried to erase. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just looked back at her, steady and whole, because I wasn't looking for resolution anymore. I had already found it. In the women who met on Wednesdays to talk about power and loss. In the interns who now walked with certainty down the halls. In the records updated to include my name, not as an employee number but as a voice. That night before bed, I sat at Richard's desk, the invitation resting beside the photo of us in our early years. I picked up my pen and wrote a new note. Not to the board, not to the company, not even to Melanie. To me, dear Lillian, you were always more than they let you be. And now, you are exactly as powerful as you always feared to be. The world just caught up. Rest well, woman of thunder. You've already spoken. I folded it gently, slid it into the drawer, and turned out the light. The next few months rolled by with the quiet grace of late autumn. Leaves changed outside my kitchen window, and I found myself appreciating things I once moved past without thought. A warm cup of tea, the rustle of papers on my desk, the simple click of a pen. I didn't know what healing looked like before. Now I did. It didn't come with fireworks. It came with rhythm. The rhythm of waking up without anxiety, of walking into a room without bracing myself, of answering the phone without fear of who might be on the other end. I hadn't spoken to David since our brief encounter at the market. There were no apologies, no angry calls, just space. And that space, oddly enough, became sacred. Sometimes the best way to love someone is to stop standing in the same fire they keep starting. At the archive, the group had grown so large we were asked to move into the main conference room on Thursdays. That room used to be off-limits to non-executives. Now it hosted stories. One woman, Anne, a data analyst in her 50s, stood up during a session and said, "I thought I was done. I thought they'd retire me before I was ready. But Lillian made me realize I'm not obsolete. I'm just not noisy." The room applauded, not with fanfare, but with reverence. That same day, Cynthia asked if I would consider helping HR design a program for recognizing silent contributors, the people who rarely asked for recognition but carried the weight of departments on their backs. I agreed. But I asked for one condition. I don't want plaques, I said. I want legacy files. She blinked. Legacy files. Yes, I smiled. A written record of what these people have actually done, not their job descriptions, but their actual stories. Real names, real wins, real impact. If they leave or retire, I want the next person to know whose shoes they're stepping into. She nodded slowly. That's brilliant. I didn't think it was brilliant. I thought it was overdue. One evening, as I was organizing some of my own papers at home, I came across a photograph I hadn't seen in years. It was taken in the company break room long before the renovations, long before the sleek coffee machines and polished glass walls. In the photo, I was laughing seated between two co-workers who'd since retired. There was a cake in front of us, lopsided and homemade. Someone had written "to the unsung heroes" in frosting. I touched the edge of the picture and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that. Not politely, not out of relief, but deeply, freely. Maybe that was the next goal? To laugh like that again? The following week, something unexpected happened. Melanie called. Not from her number, from an unknown one. When I answered, I didn't say her name. I just waited. Lillian, she began, her voice distant but even. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. I don't know what I want, I replied honestly. A pause. Then I'm not calling to reopen old wounds. I heard about the mentorship program, and the legacy files, and what you're doing for the company. It's impressive. I didn't respond. She continued. I realize now I spent so much time trying to prove I was worthy of the room, I forgot to notice who built it. That caught me off guard. Melanie never lacked intelligence, but humility was foreign soil to her. Why now? I asked. Because I'm trying to do better, she said. Somewhere else. For someone else. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. Because forgiveness isn't a transaction, it's a process. And we were just at the threshold. But I did say, I hope you mean it. I do. Then start by listening more than you speak. Another pause. Then, that's what you did, isn't it? I had to, I said softly. No one heard me otherwise. She let out a breath. Thank you, Lillian. For what? For not letting me erase you. I swallowed hard. You didn't, I said. I remembered myself before it was too late. When the call ended, I sat in the silence for a long time. Not the kind of silence that hurt, but the kind that healed. Later that night, I wrote a new entry in the archives binder. A quote for the next session. It read, "They will try to silence you with titles, timing, and tactics. But the woman who carries memory and mercy is louder than all of them because she speaks in actions that echo beyond her name." No one would know I wrote it. That was fine. The point wasn't to be remembered. The point was to remind, and as long as someone was listening, I had no intention of being quiet again. The days grew shorter. Winter crept in with its usual hush, its pale skies and early dusk. It had been nearly a year since the meeting that changed everything. A year since I stood in that boardroom and reminded them who I was. A year since I lost my job and gained back something far more valuable, myself. In January, HR officially launched the legacy file system across all departments. Each employee with more than 10 years of service received a personal interview recorded with transcripts chronicling their contributions in their own words. Not just the metrics, not the bullet points on a resume, but their stories. I sat in on several sessions as an advisor. One afternoon, I listened to Marcia from facilities recount how she used to buy breakfast from her own paycheck for the overnight janitors who had no time to eat before their shifts. Another Tom from shipping told us how he once personally drove 4 hours to deliver a critical client package during a snowstorm when couriers shut down. None of this was in any company archive, but it lived in them. And now it lived in us. It was funny how the things we don't document end up being the only things that matter. I often wondered how much history had already been lost because people assumed it wasn't worth writing down. That's the cruelty of quiet workers. They carry everything, then leave nothing behind. Unless someone opens the door. One Tuesday, Cynthia stopped by my office, a small room with a plant I kept forgetting to water, and a window that faced the parking lot. She knocked as she always did. "You free for a minute?" Always, I smiled. She sat across from me, looked out the window for a long beat, then turned. "I've been offered a position at another firm. Larger, international, triple the salary." I blinked. "That's incredible, but I'm thinking of turning it down." That surprised me. "Why?" She sighed. "Because here I matter." "You'd matter anywhere," I said. "Not like here. Here I'm not just a title. I'm part of something that feels alive. What we've built, the mentorships, the files, the space to grow. It's not just HR. It's cultural architecture. I don't want to abandon that." I leaned forward. "Then don't." She nodded. I just needed to hear it out loud. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You know, I get credit for a lot of this," she said. "But we both know where the shift really started." I said nothing. She smiled. "You didn't just hold them accountable, Lillian. You gave the rest of us permission to care." After she left, I sat in that silence again. Not the kind that followed loss, the kind that follows truth. That week, I finally finished cleaning out Richard's drawer. The last item was an old envelope yellowed with age tucked behind a stack of unused checks. Inside, there was no money, just a note. "When they forget your value, remind them who taught them what it means." Not by speaking louder, but by refusing to disappear. It wasn't signed, but I knew his handwriting. He must have written it long before he fell sick. Maybe even before he started accumulating those shares. He always believed in quiet power. So did I. The following Monday, I hosted a final archive session before the new year. The topic was return. How we return to ourselves after being diminished. How we return to our values after betrayal. How we return to our truth after being rewritten by someone else's story. I asked everyone to bring one thing they'd lost and one thing they'd reclaimed. Some brought photos, others old journals. One woman brought the heels she used to wear before she was told to dress her age. When it was my turn, I placed a coffee mug on the table. It was chipped, faded, a relic from my cubicle. The words once printed on it were nearly gone now, but if you looked closely, you could still make them out. "Do the work? Let them notice later." It had been a gift from Richard. I picked it up, raised it slightly like a toast, and said, "This mug sat on my desk for 20 years. I never once thought it meant anything. But now I know it wasn't just a vessel for caffeine. It was a prophecy." Laughter rippled around the room, but behind that laughter I saw something deeper. Recognition. Because they knew what I meant. They knew what it was to give and be forgotten, to serve and be dismissed, to stay and be invisible, but not anymore. Not now. Not in this room. Not in this company. Not with each other. After the session, a young woman named Kiara approached me. She was new, barely a few months in, and had been quiet during the circle. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. How do you know when it's time to speak up?" I paused, then answered, "When the cost of silence starts sounding like your own funeral." She nodded slowly, blinking back tears. "That's what I needed to hear." "Good," I said, touching her arm gently. "Then it's already begun." And just like that, another voice joined the chorus. Another woman remembered her worth. Another legacy began. It was a snowy Thursday when I walked back into the building with nothing but a small folder under my arm. No title, no task list. Just the weight of everything I'd seen, everything I'd survived. There was something final in the air, like the end of a play when the lights dim, but the applause hasn't quite started yet. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Inside that folder was something new. A proposal for a company-wide program called Echo. The idea came to me late one night while I was staring at the ceiling thinking about Richard's note about Kiara's question about Melanie's silent retreat. Echo wasn't just mentorship. It wasn't just memory. It was continuity. A way to document and honor the ripple effects of invisible contributions. Not just who trained whom or who mentored whom, but who inspired whom. A living, breathing record of lineage not by blood, but by influence. Each participant would name the person who helped shape their voice inside the company. One name per entry, one influence acknowledged. Even if that person had left years ago, even if they'd never heard thank you. And most important, each person would also write one message forward. Something to leave behind in case their voice one day disappeared in the shuffle of reorganizations and turnovers. It was, in essence, an emotional family tree. And like all trees, it would take time to grow. I presented it to Cynthia that afternoon. She flipped through the draft quietly, her eyes darting from paragraph to paragraph, her expression slowly softening. Then, without lifting her gaze, she said, "This is the most meaningful idea I've seen in my entire career." "I didn't create it," I replied. "I just listened long enough to hear it forming in the silence." She closed the folder, slid it back to me. "Let's do it." So we did. Echo launched in spring just as the flowers outside the office courtyard began their timid return. Daffodils pushing through thawed earth. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Some employees were hesitant at first. Vulnerability in the workplace had never been encouraged before. But once the first few names were shared, quiet tributes to long-retired clerks, to night shift supervisors, to mentors who had long since vanished, the dam broke. Stories poured in. Gratitude for a kind word said during a crisis. Admiration for someone who dared to speak up in a meeting. Recognition for those who led with kindness, even when kindness wasn't fashionable. Within months, Echo became a permanent fixture of onboarding. New hires were encouraged to read through the wall of names and stories, not as a requirement, but as a window into what made this place human. A plaque was installed in the west hallway, not of names, but of a single quote. "What you do here will echo long after your name is gone." I didn't ask for credit. I didn't need it, because by then I'd already seen the legacy. One afternoon, Kiara stopped me outside the copy room. "Lillian," she said, "I wanted you to be the name I wrote down. But someone already listed you." I smiled. Then I guess my voice is louder than I thought. She hesitated, then added, "Can I tell you what I wrote in my message forward?" "Of course." She reached into her bag and handed me a small printed card. "To whoever comes after me, you are not too quiet. You are not too old. You are not too late. You are the continuation of everyone who dared to stay." My throat tightened. "That's beautiful," I whispered. "I learned it from watching you." That evening, I returned home, poured a glass of wine, and sat at the kitchen table where I had once stared into a termination letter from my own daughter-in-law. It felt like another lifetime. Because in a way, it was that woman, the one who sat there with trembling hands and a folder she didn't ask for. She still lived inside me. But she wasn't running the show anymore. Now I moved with clarity, with intention, with a history behind me that refused to be buried. Melanie hadn't contacted me again. David sent a card on my birthday signed only with his name, no message. And that was fine. Sometimes healing doesn't end in reunions. Sometimes it ends in relief. That night, I pulled out a fresh page and wrote the first line of my own Echo message. "If you feel invisible, you're not." Then I paused, stared at the blinking cursor, then wrote the second line. "You're just standing in a room that doesn't yet deserve to hear you." I folded the page, slipped it into the back of my legacy file. Maybe no one would ever read it. Or maybe one day a girl named Kiara or someone like her would, and if she did, she'd know someone once stood where she stands now, and survived. Spring turned into summer with an ease that felt earned. I began walking to work again, just a few blocks each morning under the soft canopy of blooming trees. The city hummed in a way I hadn't heard in years, subtle, steady, not demanding attention, just existing. Like me, the mentorship program now had a waiting list. Echo had gone company-wide. Even departments I'd never set foot in tech marketing facilities were submitting legacy entries, honoring people who in any other version of history would have been forgotten behind locked login screens and long deactivated IDs. One day, I passed a small note pinned to the community board near the break room. It was written in looping cursive on plain stationery. "For L.C. You taught us all that memory is not nostalgia. It's accountability." There was no signature. I didn't need one. That note wasn't for my name. It was for what I stood for. And perhaps that was what all of this had really been about, not reclaiming a job or punishing someone who betrayed me, but proving that memory had muscle. That dignity could shake ceilings. That presence, quiet, consistent, and unwavering, wasn't the absence of power. It was its root. On a warm Tuesday, Cynthia pulled me aside after a meeting. There's talk about naming the new training center, she said casually. I raised a brow. She smiled. The team voted. They want to name it after you. My heart fluttered. Cynthia, it's not a favor. It's the truth catching up. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought of all the times I'd been overlooked. All the performance reviews that called me steady and reliable, like it was a limitation. All the meetings where my suggestions were repeated by younger voices and finally heard. And now, my name would sit above the threshold of a space where others came to learn how to speak. I nodded once. If they want it, let them have it. 2 weeks later, they unveiled the plaque. The Lillian Crowley Center for Thoughtful Leadership, built on silence that refused to stay silent. I stood next to it that afternoon, one hand lightly tracing the engraved letters. Behind me, people snapped pictures, clapped, posted online. But I barely heard them. I was listening to something deeper, the click of time settling into its right place. After the ceremony, I found myself back in my office, seated in my worn leather chair, the window cracked open just enough to let the breeze stir the curtains. There was a knock. "Come in," I called. It was Cynthia holding a file. "I almost forgot," she said. "This came for you." She handed it over and left without a word. It was a thin manila envelope addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Melanie's. I opened it carefully. Inside a single page. "Lillian, you don't owe me anything, but I owe you everything. I built my career by climbing ladders others held for me, yours most of all. And when I got to the top, I kicked at the hands that steadied me. I'm sorry. I've stepped away from corporate. I'm working with women who've left the system, those like you, before they become like me. I carry your voice in every room now, and I hope one day that matters more than what I took from you. M." I stared at the letter for a long time, then folded it slowly and tucked it into the back of my notebook, the one where I recorded the stories of those who'd made it through. No reply was needed. Her voice would echo now, even if she never heard mine again. That evening, as the sun set in ribbons of orange and rose, I walked home past a group of interns gathered outside the building, laughing loudly about something I didn't understand. One of them caught sight of me, quieted the group, and said, "That's her." Another turned eyes wide. "The one who changed everything." I smiled faintly and kept walking. I didn't correct them, because sometimes legends are born not from the loudest actions, but from the ones that dared to last. And in a world where everyone shouts, I had chosen to whisper long enough to be heard forever. By midsummer, the Lillian Crowley Center for Thoughtful Leadership had become more than just a name on a door. It had become a movement, quiet but undeniable. Each week, dozens of employees passed through its glass threshold, not to be reshaped, but to rediscover their shape. There were no lanyards with buzzwords, no icebreakers about strengths and weaknesses, just space and questions. What do you believe? Who taught you to care? Where did you learn to stay silent, and what would it take to make you speak? And through it all, I remained there. Not as a manager, not even as a mentor in the traditional sense, just present. A witness, a keeper of memory, a living reminder that what the world deems outdated is often just unappreciated wisdom waiting for a more patient generation. One afternoon, I was invited to join a session for new hires. They sat in a circle, bright-eyed and unscarred by time, holding notebooks still untouched by corporate jargon. The room smelled faintly of coffee and possibility. A young woman asked, "What's the one thing you wish you had said earlier in your career?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "I wish I had said, 'That's not fair,' when it wasn't. I wish I had said, 'I deserve more,' when I did. I wish I had stopped whispering my worth to people who were shouting over it. And I wish I had stopped apologizing for taking up space in a room I helped build." Silence followed. The kind of silence that lets truth land without needing to be explained. Another hand went up. "Do you regret not speaking sooner?" I looked around the circle, faces full of hope and fear, ambition and fragility. "I regret waiting," I admitted, "but I don't regret speaking. Even late truth is better than silence that never arrives." The session ended with hugs instead of handshakes. Later that evening, I found myself revisiting a box I had long ignored, one filled with old trinkets from my earliest days at the company. Inside was my first employee badge, my name printed in bold sans serif. the edges frayed. A pin commemorating 10 years of service. A yellowing company newsletter with a photo of me standing behind a reception desk half-shadowed unnamed, but buried at the bottom was something unexpected. A sealed envelope, the kind Richard used to leave for me when he wanted to say something without saying it. I opened it. Inside was a note written in the familiar slant of his hand. You always thought I was the builder, Lillian, but you were the foundation. When they stop seeing you shake the ground beneath them, they'll remember you then, and they'll build differently ever after. R. I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I placed the note on my desk at the center. A few days later, Kiara asked if she could borrow it to include in an upcoming workshop. It says, "What we're all trying to say," she told me, "only better." I let her take it on one condition, that she'd pass it on to someone else when the time came. Because that was the secret. Not just to survival, but to legacy. You don't just leave footprints. You leave direction. One evening, while locking up the center, I paused by the glass door and saw my reflection, older, silver-haired eyes lined with years but still bright. Behind me, in the faint light of the hallway, the words engraved in brass caught the edge of the light, built on silence that refused to stay silent. And I thought, that's what I had done. Not loudly, not perfectly, but with enough courage to break a pattern. With enough patience to let the echo grow louder than the dismissal. With enough grace to write my name in a place where no one could erase it. Not because it was mine, but because it was ours. Ours to claim. Ours to protect. Ours to pass on. And as I turned off the lights and stepped out into the warm dusk, I knew the truth down to my bones. My daughter-in-law may have fired me in silence, but I answered in legacy, and it's still speaking. The weeks that followed moved with a kind of stillness, like the hush of a theater after the curtain falls just before the applause begins. I wasn't center stage anymore, nor did I want to be. But I was still in the building, still in the rooms where memory was being made, still showing up on Thursdays for archive meetings, on Mondays for orientation welcomes, and in between for anyone who knocked gently on my open door. And they did knock. There was something about knowing I'd stayed, knowing I hadn't let a closed door be the end, that made others feel like they could ask questions without shame. One afternoon, a man in his early 50s, Brent from procurement, stopped me in the hallway. "I'm thinking of retiring early," he said. "My son just got into college, and I've been asking myself, have I done enough?" I looked at him, saw the wear in his face. Not exhaustion, but erosion. The kind that happens when the world grinds you down gently over time. I asked, "What does enough mean to you?" He hesitated. "That I mattered." "Then let someone else decide." "What?" "Write it down. Everything you've done here. Not in a resume, in a letter. Then hand it to someone you've mentored, someone younger. Let them decide if you mattered." He stared at me, then nodded. 2 weeks later, I received a hand-delivered envelope at my desk. Inside was Brent's letter, an 8-page account of everything he'd ever built, saved, reworked, or fought for. Policies he quietly rewrote, vendors he held accountable, people he advocated for. It ended with, "I didn't always get credit, but I always gave care. And maybe that's what changes a company more than a title ever will." I added it to the archive under Voices That Stayed. That section was growing. Some were typed, some handwritten, some anonymous, but all of them shared one thing in common. They refused to let their lives be footnotes in someone else's story. That month, we hosted our first interdepartmental retreat. Not a corporate training, not a team-building cliché, but a full-day gathering built around one theme: reclamation. Each session was centered around something that had once been taken time, respect, opportunity, and how to name it, mourn it, and take it back. I opened the day with a reading from my own journal, a piece I hadn't intended to share. It read, "They called me dependable, steady, quiet," as if silence was the absence of thought. But silence is a choice. And when I finally spoke, I broke the floor beneath them and showed them how I'd been holding up the ceiling all along. When I looked up, the room was still, eyes wide, some teary, and then applause. Not polite, not rehearsed, true applause. Because something in that room had shifted again. Not dramatically, just enough. Just like all change that lasts. That night, I returned home and stood for a long while in front of the mirror in my bedroom. The same mirror where I'd once straightened my blouse before walking into Melanie's office to be fired. The same mirror where I'd once touched my face wondering if my age had become my expiration. Now I saw something else entirely. I saw a woman who had been dismissed but didn't disappear, who had been silenced but grew louder without shouting, who had been broken but rebuilt herself with no blueprint but truth. I picked up my pen and wrote another entry in the archive journal. A new edition, untitled. It read, "Don't teach them to shout. Teach them to wait. Wait for the moment when truth is the only voice left. Then speak and watch the room reorient around you." This is what they were never prepared for. A woman with memory. A woman with patience. A woman who's stayed long enough to become the proof. I closed the book. The wind rustled outside. And in the hush that followed, I could almost hear Richard's voice, soft, smiling. "Told you, Lillian. You were never too quiet. You were just waiting to be unforgettable." And now, the final stretch of the year arrived with that specific kind of calm that only follows storms you've already survived. I no longer felt the need to brace myself walking into a meeting. I no longer felt like I had to prove anything. I had become something I never thought I'd be again. Whole. One morning, as I unlocked the door to the Lillian Crowley Center, I found an envelope taped gently to the inside. No name, just a sticky note that said, "To the one who stayed." Inside was a photograph, an old one I hadn't seen in years. It was of me, Richard, and a younger Melanie. We were at a company picnic. She was sitting beside me on a checkered blanket, laughing at something I'd said. Her face was soft open. Mine was joyful in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be since. On the back, someone had written, "We weren't always strangers." I stared at the words for a long time. I didn't know who left the envelope. It could have been Melanie. It could have been David. It could have been someone else entirely, someone who'd simply seen too much and wanted to give something back. But the truth of the message rang deeper than its origin. Because no, we hadn't always been strangers. And somewhere along the line, we had chosen to forget each other. Or perhaps more honestly, we had failed to remember. I sat with that for days, let it move through me. And then I wrote a letter of my own. "Melanie, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't even know if you want to, but I've carried something for a long time and I'd like to put it down. There was a time you looked at me with trust, called me Mom, held my hand while laboring through contractions, laughed at my jokes, asked for recipes. Then came distance, sharp edges, words we can't unsay. I can't erase what happened. I won't try. But if you ever wonder whether I still see the girl in that photograph, the answer is yes. We don't need to be close again. But I won't carry bitterness in the place where grace can grow. I'll always be here, soft-spoken perhaps, but unshakable. You may have removed me from your office, but not from your story. And I hope one day we both find peace in the chapters we never wrote." Lillian. I didn't send it, not because I was afraid, but because sometimes saying something aloud to yourself is enough. Sometimes the writing is the release. Later that week, the company launched a quarterly publication, Voices of the Archive, a curated selection of reflections from employees who'd submitted stories through the Echo Project. I was asked to write the foreword. This is what I wrote. "We don't always get to control the moments we're silenced, but we do get to decide what we say when we finally speak. These stories aren't revenge. They're reminders. That power isn't always loud. That legacy doesn't need a podium. That sometimes the person in the corner of the room is the one holding the map. Read these voices. Let them echo. And if you're quiet, be quiet like thunder, waiting patient but impossible to ignore." Lillian Crowley. The issue was printed in soft cream paper bound simply, no logos or flashy colors. Just stories. And people, real ones. That evening, as I left the office, I paused in the main lobby where a new display had been installed, a rotating digital wall of quotes from the archive. One flickered into place as I passed. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. I didn't recognize the quote. It wasn't mine, but it made me stop. Because once upon a time, I had been fired in silence. And now, I had become the standard, not by demanding attention, but by outlasting their expectations, by staying when they thought I'd break, by building something after they cleared the space of me, and most of all, by never letting the room decide my worth. That night, I walked home in a gentle rain, my bag tucked under my arm, my collar turned up my heart, quiet, not empty, just full in a new way. And I thought, let them come. Let the new voices rise. Let the ones like Melanie grow and stumble, and if they're lucky, return with better questions. I've made space for them, because I stayed, and because I spoke, and because I let the silence become the loudest thing they'll never forget. The final legacy file entry I ever wrote didn't have a date. It didn't need one. I wrote it on a morning like any other coffee-warm light streaming through the windows of the Lillian Crowley Center. Outside, the city moved the way it always had, but inside something felt still, complete. I sat at my desk, no meeting scheduled, no agenda to chase, and opened a fresh page in the archive. And I began. This isn't an ending, it's a handoff. If you're reading this, then the work is still alive. You might be new. You might be tired. You might be wondering if anyone sees you at all. I did. I do. I was you. Don't let the silence trick you into thinking you're invisible. Silence isn't emptiness. It's preparation. Let it shape you but not erase you. Then when the time comes, speak in a way they'll never forget. Not because it's loud, but because it's true. I closed the book, stared at the cover, then traced my fingers across the leather spine like it was something sacred. Because it was every story inside that archive, every anonymous note, every trembling voice, every bold declaration was now part of the company's real DNA, not the glossy brochure kind. The kind written in coffee stains, missed promotions, quiet breakthroughs, and long overdue acknowledgments. It was time for me to step back. Not out, just back. I'd told the board months earlier I wouldn't be renewing my consulting contract after the year ended. They offered a position on the advisory council. I declined gently. I don't want to be the voice they rely on, I said. I want them to find their own. And they were. Kiara had taken over the archive program with quiet brilliance. Paige was leading the mentorship rotation, adding a tech component that allowed remote staff to join from around the world. Even Brent, who'd once asked if he mattered, was now training younger procurement staff with a grace that could only come from someone who had once nearly disappeared himself. They didn't need me to keep the fire burning. They had become the flame. That week, I cleared out my small office. Not out of sadness, but with the kind of joy that only arrives when a chapter has nothing left to prove. I packed a few keepsakes, a photo of Richard, a pressed flower Kiara once gave me, my old coffee mug, and left the rest behind. On my last day, I arrived early and walked through each floor, slowly, quietly, like someone saying goodbye to an old house filled with memories. When I reached the main lobby, I paused again by the digital quote wall. A new quote had just rotated in. She turned determination into a foundation. We walk on what she built. I didn't cry. I just breathed it in, owned it, then walked out. At home, I made tea, sat on the porch, and waited for the light to shift into that golden hour Richard used to call the pause before memory. That's when a small envelope slid through my mail slot. No return address. Just one word written on the front, respect, inside a single note. You taught me how to lead by losing you. I didn't understand grace until it left the room. I carry your silence now with more care than I carried my voice. M. For a long time I held that note, not as a token of closure but as proof that what you plant in silence will grow louder than anything said in the moment. That, what they remove from your resume, they will one day etch in stone. That, what you survive, becomes what they remember. And in that remembering you live again. In stories, in systems, in the women who rise without apology because someone like you once stayed, once spoke, once reminded the world. You don't have to roar to be the reason the ground moves. I placed the note in the archive folder beside my last entry and closed the cover for the final time. Then I made one last addition. The simplest one, a postscript, legacy confirmed. Sometimes I sit with a cup of tea and wonder if anyone remembers the day I was fired. Not the headlines, not the board meeting, just the moment itself. The quiet one in a cold office with a daughter-in-law I once called family, looking at me like I was nothing more than a spreadsheet she had the authority to delete. Funny how that wasn't the end. It was the beginning. From that moment forward, I stopped asking for space and started building it. I didn't become powerful in the traditional sense. I didn't claw my way back with lawsuits or press releases. I became powerful by remembering who I was before they told me I wasn't enough, and by becoming the mirror that reminded others of their own reflection. You see, that's the thing about being erased. You start to see all the other people who are disappearing too. And if you're brave, if you stay just a little longer, you can become the voice that makes them visible again. To this day, my name hangs above a doorway. But what matters more are the names that pass beneath it. The ones who now walk into boardrooms without apology. The ones who stay at the table even when they weren't invited. The ones who whisper, "I am still here," until the room rearranges around them. So if you're reading this wondering if it's too late, it's not. Speak. Write it down. Stay if you can. And if they push you out, walk through that exit knowing this. Walls fall. Legacies do not. And one day someone will say your name in a room full of silence. And everything will shift. Because you stayed long enough to become the truth they couldn't erase. Lillian Crowley.